This is LSAT Prep Test 139, Section 3, Passage 3. This is a dual or comparative passage about software patents, medium difficulty set. The trap on this one's kind of subtle because both passages basically agree, but they look different enough that students assume there's a fight when there isn't. Now, Passage A is from a 2007 article on the patent system. It builds a case in layers. The opening gives you the principle that patents are supposed to be for non-obvious inventions. Then it immediately shows you that principle falling apart. For example, a court granted a patent on translating between an internet address and a phone number. That's the author telling you this system isn't working the way it was designed to work. And from there, the passage explains why. The courts dropped the bar for what counts as obvious, and patents got so broad that the concept of inventing around them, designing your product to avoid someone else's patent, became impossible. And here's where you need to slow down. The author introduces this idea of nuclear stockpiling. Companies started grabbing hundreds or thousands of patents, not because the patents were valuable on their own. They grabbed them so they would have ammunition if someone sued them. They're saying, sue me, I'll sue you back. It's meant to be a deterrent. And if you don't play that game, you're going to be exposed. Now, the end of Passage A adds one more layer. Software is built from modular components. So any product you make is probably bumping into tons of existing patents. And because software is so complex, you can't even figure out which patents you might be violating. A company that genuinely wanted to license everything couldn't do it. That shows you this system is unworkable. Now, Passage B. This is a corporate statement, and you can feel the difference immediately. The tone is public-facing, it's polished. This is a company talking to its community, and they open with a clear position. Patents hurt software innovation and clash with open source values. There's no ambiguity there. But the most important paragraph in Passage B is the one that starts with the company admitting they've got to live in the real world. Now, you want to read that section carefully. The company says large corporations have built massive patent portfolios. Those portfolios get misused, and the patents themselves are questionable. Litigation is expensive, so the only practical defense is to build your own portfolio to fight fire with fire. And then the very end of Passage B is where the tension reaches its height. The company says it adopted this strategy reluctantly. It flags the perceived inconsistency with its own anti-patent stance. And that word perceived is doing real work here. The company is acknowledging the contradiction but softening it. They're saying, yes, this looks hypocritical, but pragmatism wins. So what is the relationship between these two passages? They agree on almost everything. Both of them think software patents are broken. Both of them describe the same arms race, companies stockpiling patents. And both of them recognize that opting out of the system leaves you vulnerable. The difference is where they're standing when they say it. Passage A is an outside observer diagnosing a broken system. Passage B is a player inside that system explaining why they're doing something they don't believe in. Now, the key move for this passage is that Passage B is living proof of what Passage A describes. Passage A says companies feel forced to stockpile patents defensively. Passage B is a company doing exactly that and telling you why. If you see that connection, the relationship questions become straightforward. Now, the main trap is reading Passage B as being pro-patent. It is not. The company opposes patents in principle. Every single thing they do with patents, they frame as being reluctant and defensive. If a question asks about Passage B's attitude towards software patents, the answer is negative, with a practical exception. Now, one more thing you want to watch. The questions here will probably test whether you know which details show up in which passage. Passage A talks about courts lowering the standard for obviousness, and that's only Passage A. Passage A explains why software's modular structure makes patent avoidance impossible. Again, only Passage A here. Passage B talks about open source values and names its own community. That is only Passage B. The shared ground here is the arms race and the defensive stockpiling. You want to keep those boundaries clear. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to check yourself on three things. First, can you explain why the company in Passage B pursues patents despite opposing them? Second, what does invent around mean in passage A? And why does the author say it doesn't work for software? And third, if someone asked you whether these two passages disagree, could you explain why the answer is basically no? So that was prep test 139, passage 3. We're going to go on now to passage 4. Just getting set up here. This is LSAT Prep Test 139, Section 3, Passage 4. This is the Calvaria Major passage, the rare tree supposedly linked to the dodo. This is a science passage. The hook is a hypothesis that sounds brilliant, but doesn't survive the last paragraph. Difficulty level here is medium. The passage here introduces a flashy theory, builds it up, and then knocks it down. The main point is that Temple's hypothesis connecting the tree's decline to the dodo's extinction is creative, but the evidence doesn't back it up. Now, the most important paragraph here is paragraph 4. That's where the author finally stops being polite about Temple's work. If you skim it, you're going to overestimate how much the author buys the hypothesis. Now, paragraph 1 is the background. You want to move through it at a steady pace, but don't linger. Calvaria major is a rare tree on Mauritius. The dodo lived there also and went extinct about 300 years ago. Temple, an ecologist, noticed something. He could only find 13 of these trees, all of them estimated at over 300 years old, and none were reproducing. The timeline matched. The dodo disappears, tree stops making new trees. So he proposed a connection. And your only job here is to register that this is Temple's claim, not established fact. The author is just setting the table. Now, paragraph 2 is Temple making his case. And this is where the hypothesis gets its charm. He thought the fruit had evolved these incredibly thick pits because dodos ate them. The dodo's gizzard would grind the pit down, and that abrasion was the thing that actually let the seed sprout. Without the dodo, the pit was too tough, the seed couldn't break out. Temple called it lethal imprisonment. It's a great phrase, very dramatic. And that is the point. Notice how vivid his language is compared to how the author frames everything else. The author is just presenting Temple's argument here, not co-signing on the argument. Now, you can move through the specifics here pretty quickly because the details matter less than the shape of the claim. Now, paragraph 3 is where most students go wrong. It looks like it's strengthening Temple's case. He ran experiments. He fed pits to turkeys. 3 seeds germinated and he felt vindicated. But the author is not impressed. I mean, look at the language here. Right at the top, the author says direct proof was unattainable. Then Temple's extra work only lent his argument a semblance of rigor. A semblance of rigor, not rigor itself, just the appearance of it. And the author says Temple saw the planted seeds as vindicating his hypothesis. That is the author keeping distance. If the author agreed, you would have seen something like confirmed or demonstrated. Instead, you get he saw as. That is the author saying Temple believed his own results, not that the results were actually convincing. If you miss those signals, you're going to think this paragraph is support, but it's not. It's Temple celebrating while the author just watches. Now, you want to slow way down here for paragraph 4. This is where the passage lands. 2 researchers punch holes in Temple's whole story. First, you've got Strom. She is the foremost expert on Calvaria major, and she found hundreds of young trees, hundreds of them. Temple said the species was not reproducing. Strom showed it was. And that one finding guts the entire premise. Then Speak ran his own research and found that enough seeds germinate without any dodo involvement to keep the species alive. And so the reproductive crisis Temple built his hypothesis around may not even exist. And then the author does something smart right at the end. Instead of just saying Temple was wrong, the passage offers a different explanation. The decline could be from disease and damage caused by non-native animals introduced to Mauritius over the past few centuries. And that alternative matters because it redirects everything. The problem, turns out, might have nothing to do with the dodo at all. Now, here is the key move. The passage is built on a gap between how good the hypothesis sounds and how weak the evidence actually is. Now, Temple's story is elegant. A tree and a bird co-evolved, linked in life and death. It's the kind of thing you want to be true. And the test is counting on that. The hardest questions here are going to target whether you separated your feelings about the hypothesis from what the author actually concludes. Now, the author's stance is clear by the end. Temple's idea is creative, but probably wrong. The main trap is treating the passage as a celebration of clever science. It's more like a cautionary tale about a hypothesis that ran ahead of the data. If you picked up admiration for Temple's ingenuity, you read the tone of paragraphs 2 and 3, but you missed paragraph 4. Students who make that mistake will pick answers that are too generous to Temple on main point and author attitude questions. Now, before you get to the questions, you want to check yourself on these 3 things. First, why does the author specifically mention that Strom is the foremost expert? Second, what does a semblance of rigor tell you about the author's opinion of Temple's experiments? And third, why does the passage end with non-native animals instead of circling back to the dodo? So that was passage 4. Now we're going to move on to test 138. This is LSAT Prep Test 138, Section 1, Passage 1. This is a humanities passage about corridos, narrative folk songs from the lower Rio Grande border. It's a low difficulty passage, but that doesn't mean these are free points here. Students lose questions here because everything sounds the same and they stop paying attention to what each detail is actually doing. Now, this is a survey passage. The author isn't arguing for or against anything. They are explaining what corridos are, how they work, and why they matter to border communities. The main point is that corridos follow strict formal conventions, borrowed from older traditions, and those same conventions are what make them a bonding force for the communities that sing them. Now, the most important section is the middle of the passage where the author lays out the formal features. That's where the test is going to pull questions from. So we're going to go through the whole thing here. Now, paragraph 1 is background. Corridos are narrative folk songs. They come from a region split between Mexico and the US. They flourished from about 1836 to the 1930s, and they have roots in 18th century Spanish ballad tradition. You also learn that corridos combine formal features from several different types of folk songs, but they always deal with border subject matter. So you want to hold on to that idea. The form comes from multiple traditions, the content is always local, and so that matters. You want to move at a normal speed through the next section. You get El Corrido de Quiances, the oldest complete surviving corrido. Now, the date here doesn't matter. Just know it's there as a reference point. Then the author says a single important event could inspire many corrido variants, but each version follows the same standard generic elements. Now, the phrase standard generic elements is easy to skip, but it's reinforcing the entire thesis. Even when the stories change, the form stays the same. Now you want to slow down. The passage tells you corridos were sung at social gatherings. And then it says something students glide right past. Corridos didn't just record what happened locally, they relied heavily on familiar language and thematic conventions to affirm the cohesiveness of border communities. That's the author tipping their hand, revealing their position. Corridos aren't just songs, they are cultural glue. The conventions, like the familiar phrases and the shared themes, they're what hold the community together. If you miss that, you're going to pick answers that treat corridos as simple historical records, but they're much more than that. Now, the next section explains the style. The name comes from the Spanish verb correr, meaning to run or to flow, and corridos live up to that name. They tell their stories simply and quickly, with no embellishments. Figures of speech are rare. When metaphors do show up, they use everyday images the audience already knows. So the example about the hero comparing himself to a thunderstorm is not there because it's interesting. It's there to prove that even the figurative language stays conventional and familiar. So don't get pulled into the content of the example. Its function is to back up the point about simplicity. Then the author mentions that this same storm imagery shows up in other corridos too, including Quiances. And that is an important detail here. It tells you the images aren't just simple, they are shared across the tradition, meaning they get recycled. That is another layer of convention. Now, the last section covers the despedida, which is the formal closing verse. And that's where the structure gets very specific. The first and third lines are set, the second and fourth lines vary. The second names the subject, the fourth carries the corridos name or restates the subject. and the rhyming varies depending on what the verse needs. Now, you don't have to memorize the formula here, but you do have to know that the despedida exists as a fixed structural convention. And then the passage does something smart right at the end. It says the despedida is the clearest marker of both the corrido's uniqueness and its connection to the broader Spanish ballad tradition, both of them at once. The closing verse proves the corrido is its own genre, and it proves the corrido descends from something older. And so, if a question asks about the relationship between corridos and the Spanish ballad tradition, that is your anchor. Now, the key move in this passage is the link between convention and community. Everything formal about corridos, the set structures, the recycled imagery, the familiar language, all of that is also what makes them matter socially. The form is not a limitation, it is the whole point. The conventions are how these songs bind people together. Now, the author's stance here, their perspective, is both respectful and also explanatory. They clearly value the tradition, but they're documenting it, not defending it. The main trap here is treating this as a passage about storytelling, but it's really about how they're built and what the structure matters, why the structure matters to the people who share the tradition. It's not about what the corridos say. And so if you pick an answer focused on the content of the songs, instead of their formal conventions and social function, you're going to get it wrong. Now, before you hit the questions, check yourself on these three things. First, what is the connection between the corrido's formal conventions and its role in the community? Second, why does the author keep stressing that corrido imagery is familiar and conventional instead of being original? And third, what does the despedida tell us about how corridos can relate to the Spanish ballad tradition they came from? So that is passage 1. Next, we're going to cover passage 2. And by the way, folks, I'll be live for my regular daily live Q&A in about 2 hours, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific. We're going to cover anything and everything at all, LSAT and law school admissions during that live in about 2 hours. Now, this is LSAT PrepTest 138, Section 1, Passage 2. It is a science passage. Plants make chemicals. Insects deal with those chemicals. Over millions of years, that back and forth narrowed everything down. It's a low difficulty passage, but you don't want to be careless here because the trap here is the scope. Students pick answers that are too narrow. Now, the passage here is explaining a process that's not making an argument. It's tracing how secondary substances in plants created an evolutionary arms race with insects and how that arms race funneled insect species into eating fewer and fewer types of plants. That is the main point. Both sides shaped each other, not just plants defending themselves. Now, the most important paragraph is paragraph 3. That is where the whole passage pays off. But you're going to need the setup to get there, so we'll start at the top. Now, paragraph 1 is definitions. You move through this at a normal speed. All you've got to take away is one distinction. Primary substances are the basics: proteins, carbohydrates, vitamins. Every plant has them, and they keep the plant alive. Secondary substances are different. They don't help the plant grow or function, they just show up. And here's the detail worth holding on to. The same or similar secondary substances tend to appear in related plants, plants in the same family. That's why related plants often taste or smell alike. Now, you don't need to memorize the examples here, just grab that one idea and keep going. Paragraph 2 is a list in disguise. It gives you several different things that secondary substances do. Some attract pollinators. That's good for the plant, of course. Some are toxic to insects, also good for the plant. Some aren't toxic at all, but taste terrible, so insects learn to avoid them. Now, you're getting hit with a lot of examples here, and your instinct might be to slow down and absorb them all. Don't. They're all doing the same job. Every single example is just another way of saying plants with useful secondary substances survived and reproduced better. That is natural selection at work. The passage even says these substances have to pass the muster of natural selection. Now, paragraph 3. This is where you slow down. Everything before this was set up. Paragraph 3 is the payoff. It pulls the camera way back, millions of years of competition. Here is the sequence. Plants develop chemical defenses. Some insects can't handle them and die off or switch to other food. But some insects adapt. They evolve ways to tolerate the chemicals or detoxify them or store them or just avoid the dangerous parts of the plant. So now Those adapted insects can eat plants that other insects can't touch. And because fewer plants are available to any one species of insect, those insects start specializing. They zero in on the plants they can handle. Over time, that specialization gets tighter and tighter. And by the end of the paragraph, you're reading about insect species that are locked into narrowly defined and often botanically restricted groups of plants. And that phrase is the destination the whole passage has been driving towards. Everything before it was just getting you there. Now, here's the key move. The passage isn't really about plant defense. It's about mutual narrowing. Plants develop chemicals. Insects adapt to specific chemicals, and that adaptation locks them in. The diversity of secondary substances across plant families is what created the dietary specialization of insects, cause and effect running in both directions over evolutionary time. And that is exactly where students get burned. You'll finish this passage thinking it was about plants protecting themselves, but it partly is, but the main point is bigger than that. It's about the co-evolutionary relationship between plants and insects, how each side's moves shaped the others. And so, if you go into the questions thinking this was about plant defense, you're going to grab choices that mention defenses and chemical substances, but miss the full picture. And the test will punish you for being half right. Now, you want to watch for choices that only mention one side. If an answer talks about plants, but ignores insects, it's probably too narrow. If an answer talks about insects adapting, but doesn't connect it back to secondary substances, same problem. The correct answers on this passage will almost always capture both sides of the relationship. Now, before you touch the questions, you want to check yourself on three things. First, what is the difference between primary and secondary substances, and why does that distinction matter for the rest of the passage? Second, why does the passage give you so many different examples of what secondary substances do in paragraph 2? What is the point of all those examples? And third, and this is the big one, why have insect species ended up eating only a narrow range of plants instead of a wide range? The key move is the narrowing. Competition didn't blow things open, it squeezed them shut. Insects didn't end up eating more plants over time, they ended up eating fewer. And that's counterintuitive if you're not paying attention, and it's exactly what the hardest questions will test. So that was passage 2. We're going to move on to passage 3 now. This is LSAT PrepTest 138, Section 1, Passage 3. It's about a contradiction baked into economics since 1776. The pin factory versus the invisible hand. Medium difficulty passage. The ideas here are pretty straightforward. The trap is misreading the author's tone towards economists. Now, this is a social science passage. It's telling a story about why one economic idea got buried for 200 years. The main point is that increasing returns were always real, always obvious, but economists couldn't deal with them because the math didn't exist yet. Once the math caught up, the idea became respectable. Now, the most important paragraph is paragraph 4. That's where the author reveals what they actually think about this whole saga. Everything before it is set up, paragraph 4 is the payoff. Now, paragraph 1 lays out 2 ideas from Adam Smith. First, the pin factory. A bigger factory means workers specialize and output per person goes up. Second, the invisible hand. Self-interest, left alone, guides everyone toward the common good. Businesses sell what people want at fair prices, not out of kindness, but because competition forces them to. You want to read this at a steady pace. Your only job here is to keep these 2 ideas separate in your head. Pin factory, scale helps. Invisible hand, competition works. Paragraph 2 is where those 2 ideas collide. And this is the paragraph students tend to skim too fast. If a firm keeps getting more efficient as it grows, it's going to crush its competitors. A few huge firms take over, but the invisible hand requires lots of competitors where nobody gets to dominate. And so these 2 different ideas cancel each other out. The passage says they are opposed to each other. The author really means that. If increasing returns are real, then free markets don't self-correct the way Smith had hoped. You want to slow down here. You've got to feel the weight of this contradiction. Paragraph 3, you can pick up speed. It's explaining a choice economists made. For almost 2 centuries, They went with diminishing returns. The pin factory got dropped. Now here's what matters. Why? The author says it was not ideology. It was the line of least mathematical resistance. And that phrase is doing a lot of work. Diminishing returns were easy to model with numbers and equations. Increasing returns were not. So economists didn't reject the pin factory because they thought it was wrong. They shelved it because they couldn't make it rigorous. You want to hold on to that distinction. Now, paragraph 4, you want to slow way down. This is the heart of the passage. Economists kept trying to bring increasing returns back, but they repeatedly failed. The author even gives you a concrete example. Railroads obviously had increasing returns and everybody knew it, but the math still would not cooperate. The author uses the phrase underground river to describe how this idea stayed alive beneath the surface of mainstream economics. It kept flowing, but nobody could bring it up into the daylight. Then, in the late 1970s, someone finally figured out the formalism, and that's when the pin factory became respectable. Now notice how the author ends the passage. The last sentence says the economists finally found ways to describe it to make it respectable. So the word respectable is loaded. The author isn't saying the idea became true, it was always true. It became acceptable because it looked like real economics. Now the key move here, the pin factory was not rejected on its merits, it was rejected because the tools to express it did not exist. Now every hard question here will test whether you caught that. The author's stance is sympathetic, both to the pin factory idea and to the economists who sidelined it. And this is where students get burned. The author does not blame economists. The passage frames their choice as being practical, not stubborn. They wanted rigor, but the math wasn't there, and so they worked with what they had. Now, if you pick an answer that says the author is hostile or critical toward mainstream economists, that's wrong. The tone is closer to understandable delay than inexcusable failure. But if you pick an answer that says the author is indifferent, that's also wrong. There is a clear lean toward the pin factory throughout. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to check yourself on 3 things. First, what is the actual reason increasing returns got sidelined? Not economists disagreed with it, but what specifically held them back? Second, what changed in the late 1970s? And third, does the author think economists were wrong to go with diminishing returns, or does the author think they just didn't have a choice? So that was passage 3. We're going to cover passage 4 now. This is LSAT PrepTest 138, section 1, passage 4. This is a comparative. Let me start over on that one. This is LSAT PrepTest 138, section 1, passage 4. This is a comparative or dual passage. The topic is selective enforcement, when authorities pick and choose who to go after instead of applying the rules to everybody. Medium difficulty passage set. The passages aren't necessarily hard to read, but the relationship between them is easy to oversimplify, and that's where the points are in the questions. Now, passage A is abstract legal theory. Passage B is a real-world news story. Your job is to figure out exactly how they talk to each other, not just do they agree or disagree, but where they overlap and where they split. Now, passage A opens with a bold claim. Law enforcement agencies can basically nullify a law. They can kill it in practice just by choosing not to prosecute anybody under it. The author says this happens all the time and then explains why. Now, here is the reason. Laws are almost always over-inclusive, meaning they sweep in more people than the legislature actually wanted to punish. And that is unavoidable. You can't write a law that perfectly predicts every future situation because language is too blurry. Human behavior is too messy, and so the law ends up being too broad, and enforcement agencies fill the gap by deciding who actually deserves to get caught. Then the author introduces the fix of discretionary non-enforcement. In plain English, that means the agency just quietly chooses not to enforce the law against those who technically violated it but don't deserve punishment. And the author's pitch is that this solves over-inclusion without creating under-inclusion, meaning without accidentally opening loopholes that let guilty people escape. And in theory, that's a clean trade. Now, you want to slow down at the end of passage A. That's the paragraph most students blow past, but it's the one that matters the most for the questions. The author admits the agency makes its own The author admits that the agency picks its own cases, and that means enforcement could become random or unfair. The word you're going to see here is capricious. But the author pushes that concern aside. The argument is that legislative oversight, Congress watching over the agency, keeps things from going off the rails. Now notice the phrasing here. The author doesn't say capricious enforcement never happens. The author says it doesn't appear to be the central tendency. So that's a hedge. And the questions you could bet are going to ask about that. Then passage B drops you into a real situation. A newspaper reports that 231,000 water customers in one city are behind on their bills, some by months, some by decades. The city's plan is to selectively cut off water to a few wealthy homeowners to make an example of them and scare everybody else into paying. This is textbook selective enforcement. The city is not chasing all 231,000 people. They are handpicking targets from rich neighborhoods specifically because those people can't claim hardship. This is their strategy. But the author of passage B doesn't like this approach. The author doesn't reject the city's right to do it, but they offer a better option. Just attach a lien to the property the way creditors and tax authorities already do. The debt follows the house. When it sells, the city gets paid. No need for water shutoffs, no public shaming. Credit pressure does the work. And then comes the twist. There is a legal loophole blocking that solution. Water charges aren't classified as taxes, and under the current law, only tax debts can become liens. So the author's real argument lands at the very end. Change the law, reclassify the debt, fix the loophole. The author says this is smarter than shutting off people's water. So here's how these two passages basically relate. Passage A builds the case that selective enforcement is legitimate and an even necessary tool. Passage B shows that tool in action and argues this particular case calls for a systemic fix instead. And they are not opposites. That is the trap here. Passage B's author never says selective enforcement is always wrong. They say it's the wrong choice because a structural solution exists. And so if you walk into the questions thinking these passages are a clean agree-disagree, you're going to pick wrong answers. The real dynamic is narrower. Passage A defends discretionary enforcement in general, and Passage B's author would rather remove the need for discretion entirely and redesign the system so it handles the problem automatically. Now, the key move across both passages is this. Passage A says selective enforcement fixes a flaw in how laws are written. Passage B shows a case where fixing the law itself is the better answer. One treats discretion as the solution, the other treats discretion as the workaround you shouldn't need. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to check yourself on these three things. First, what does over-inclusive mean in Passage A, and why does the author think it's unavoidable? Second, why does the Passage B author reject water shutoffs when a lien system would work? And third, what is the one legal technicality stopping the lien approach from being used right now? Thanks for joining, folks. If you're looking for support, I'm offering free LSAT tutoring lessons for everybody watching this now or later. The link to book that free tutoring lesson with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. The link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and IG. I'll be back in about 2 hours for my daily live Q&A. Anything at all, LSAT and law school admissions. I'll see you all then.